The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.
I do want to turn now, just kind of in closing, to what might be both the most serious and the funniest session of the day. Just stay with me. You're going to understand what I'm talking about in just a moment. The issue that we're tackling is shoring up the weakest link in cybersecurity, and joining us to host an all-star and very witty, I might add, panel of experts is SIG Principal and former Director of Information Assurance at the NSA, Deborah Plunkett. Debbie, it's been a pleasure to host a series of fantastic conversations today. I'm looking forward to this conversation that you are about to host. We have Jennifer Bisegli, who's joining us, Kelly Bissell, and Kevin Mandia. And so I'm going to turn things over to you to get this started. And thank you all so much. I hope the wit comes out, because I know that you all have it, but even as we tackle this very serious topic. So my thanks and hats off to you guys.
So thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Jennifer, Kevin, and Kelly, for joining in this great conversation on shoring up the weakest link in cybersecurity, third-party risk, and supply chain vulnerabilities. You know, as I thought about this topic in prepping for today, I recall not so long ago when we were talking about the human factor being the weakest link, and that we needed to be focusing on teaching people how to not click on a link in an email, and making sure that they were not succumbing to phishing attacks, and being careful about two-factor authentication. And so it seems as if the conversation has begun to transition a bit more towards, which certainly a much more sophisticated and potentially lethal threat, and that's this third-party risk, and specifically supply chain. And so I'd love to start off by giving each of you an opportunity just to talk a little bit about where you think we are in this space, and then we're going to jump into a Q&A session. For those that are out there listening, we would welcome your questions, and I'll be keeping my eye on the chat box and make sure that we get them in as much as possible, and looking forward to a really exciting conversation. Kevin, Jennifer, and Kelly come with significant experience in the cybersecurity industry. Kevin at Mandia, and Jennifer in a company that she started and definitely focused on cybersecurity risk, and then Kelly in industry also. So we're going to start with Jennifer, and then we'll go to Kevin, and then Kelly. Just a couple of words on where, what is this all about? Why are we talking about third-party risk and supply chain vulnerabilities today?
So thanks for having me, Debbie. Super excited about the conversation. I think that, the supply chain became very, very personal, and it became very understood over the last 2.5 years. And when I say that, I often joke that my mother actually finally knows what I do for a living, because there was a cyber breach that kept us home because we couldn't get gas in our cars. Right, there was a ship got cut sideways in a canal. You have, the hits just keep on coming, and they couldn't get the right product to the store shelves. I was working out this morning, watching the news, and baby formulas being announced their arrival at the airport because of shortages. I think that the last 2.5 years, as much as many of us on the call knew how vulnerable and simply porous the supply chain was for different types of threats, the last 2.5 years, it really brought it home. And what's happened is that you have a cultural shift where so much of companies' brands and reputation are being tied to the health of their extended business relationships. When you think about third-party risk, it's no longer good enough not to know. You have to know. You're being asked, and I was watching with Sue Gordon just before this, you're being asked at the highest levels, the C-suite and at the board, about the health of your supply chain. And the fact that back in the 90s, everybody offshored manufacturing, that company offshored, that company outsourced, we became part of a very interconnected and interwoven global economy. And we got really lazy. right? We just kind of outsourced for all the right reasons. It was innovation, it was closer to customers, it was cheaper prices, it was whatever. But it came back to bite us when you have massive organizations that when a pandemic hits, they're still running their supply chain on Excel spreadsheets, right? There were pictures being passed around about bridges being imploded in Wuhan when the pandemic hit, and people figuring out that they couldn't get product out of parts of the world that they didn't even know they were doing business in. And so I think that the world got educated the last 2.5 years. I think it became very personal. I think that businesses are being valued on the health of the supply chain, whether it's the SEC filings that you have to do as a public company or private equity firms looking at, you know, the private sector. And I think there's just a clear education that's happened on a global scale that folks are not standing for it anymore. And I'll turn it over to my colleagues here in a minute, but we actually had a senator at our office for a town hall earlier this week, and they're looking to put legislation in mandating transparency of the supply chain, which different parts of the world have already started. So there's a German Supply Chain Act. There's actually a digital DORA out of the EU that's a transparency of the extended third-party relationships. So these disclosure laws are happening, and there's always a question of cost. And I kind of turn it around and say, what's the cost of not knowing anymore? But very interestingly, later that day, we were in a conversation with one of our customers, a very large global aerospace defense company. They literally sent us an email wanting to know more about the legislation because they wanted it. They knew that the health of their business, the ability to fulfill orders, the brand of the company, their profit was being tied to the health of the supply chain. So, you know, kind of in short, it happened to everybody. It was very acute. It was very much felt, and folks are realizing that they can't continue to approach the vulnerabilities or allow the vulnerabilities in the extended supply chain like they have previously.
That's great. Thank you. Kevin.
Well, Deborah, thank you so much. And, you know, I read through all the questions you want to ask us, and I figured I'd answer them all in our prepared remarks here. You know, when I was thinking about supply chain security, I kind of just thought about it from the Mandiant perspective. Well, we're a supplier of software and services as well as a consumer of the same thing. And from my vantage point, thinking about it, supply chain has two different prongs to me. There's the software supply chain, what libraries to use, what software you depend on, and the cyber aspect of it. Then there's actually the vendor security program. And I think both matter. And so I just kind of looked at how we advise companies in doing those things and how we do it ourselves. And one of the things that shocked me looking at our vendor security program at Mandiant was we're only about 3,000 people, but we have 2,800 vendors we write checks to. And I remember when we first tried to figure out what's our supply chain, and then, you know, we didn't even get to ask what's their supply chain. But in that first iteration of who do we depend on to do business, I remember I went out to all the business lines. Hey, who do we depend on? And I got mediocre answers. So then I just went right to procurement. Hey, who do we write checks to? And that's how we landed on, at that time, 2,200 people back in 2016, but it's up to 2,800. So if you think about my company being small, imagine Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, multinationals in the 10,000, 25,000 companies or more that are in their primary link of supply. And then every one of those suppliers depends on more and more smalls and mediums to help them create whatever their products are. So just figuring out who we paid was the start of it. And then over the years, first as a supplier, I remember, you know, 15 years ago, maybe we got a form. Hey, you're shipping us software. Can you fill out this one pager on what your cybersecurity program is? Today, we get audited sometimes in person. You know, COVID was almost a thank you because we stopped getting audited in person by the financial services to see how are we SOC 2 compliant. We could say yes, but they wanted to show up and see our people, you know, see the whites of our eyes. So you can see that everybody's kind of matured where the bigs take their supply chain pretty seriously, and they're going to show up and do cybersecurity type audits and ask a lot of questions. And it's not a one-page paper anymore to fill out. We spend nearly $10 million a year, which isn't that much, but that money is spent solely on the people that are responding to all the different supply chain inquiries that we've got to get just to do business with people. Then as a consumer, what we ended up doing is we have 4 different levels with every single person we do business with. We have to make sure security talks to the other side first. So we're partnered with procurement. No checks are written as we start doing business with whether it be law firm or someone doing the yard work outside our offices. We look at, do they access our data? Do they access, what office space do they access? We start with the questionnaire, but over a long process, we end up putting folks in level 1 through level 4. Level 4 being you're mowing our yard and you're not accessing any data. Level 1, you're accessing data to include potentially telemetry and customer names. So, we have initial questionnaires, we have security validation with interviews, copies of pen tests, SOC 2 certifications. We do a lot of work there. And it was interesting for me to go through this process with my team and review it. In every contract that we have, and hopefully everybody's doing this, you have breach notification in all your contracts. So that at least by contract, if one of your suppliers has a cyber breach, you are notified of that. And then you also want to bubble your exceptions to any policy you have and how you do business. At least at our company, you do it into the legal department, and really it's actually our general counsel because we're so small, and a CISO review. And then I'll leave you with this, looking at software supply chain. We could spend the whole hour on that because almost every company that I'm dealing with as a consultant is what I call an engineer forward company. They're tech companies first and foremost. And to me, it breaks down into 2 piles of risk, one easier to deal with, and one really hard to deal with. And I only wanted to talk about this because I've heard people confuse the 2. But the first is dealing with vulnerability risk in your software supply chain. That one's a little bit easier. We use products like Sneak and Legit Security, not only on our own software, but when we can on the we learn all the software that we depend on when we're shipping software, but we also recommend things like that to everybody in our software supply chain. Go to your GitHub repository, scan them for all the code you use, scan those for vulnerabilities. And what we find when we do consulting is about 5 times more instances in GitHub than companies think there's going to be. So looking at source code with Legit Security, looking at things at runtime with Sneak, really good ways to figure out your own software security as well as that of your partners. And I'll just leave you with this thought, going back to SolarWinds. There is no magic wand for finding the back doors in the supply chain. Vulnerabilities, yes, we have software and tools to do so, and you can do black box testing and source code review, and almost every company that makes software does those things because nobody wants to be the supplier with the vulnerability, and that's why they have product security. But finding the back door, I'll leave it with that thought, Deborah. There's just no magic wand to do it. When malicious code's injected, I call it embedded evil into software that goes into production, we don't have a good way to do it. So that's my shotgun blast in 5 minutes and 12 seconds on just doing what we call supply chain security management.
Great. Thanks, Kevin and Kelly. Corporate Vice President from Microsoft, what you got?
Yeah, look, I'll just sort of keep this simple because I think Jennifer and Kevin, they've said it all, but I think that for everyone else, that you have to realize that the corporate function or the company, as we used to think it was in the 80s and the 70s, if you will, is really maybe a third of what the ecosystem actually is. And that is all those third-party suppliers, fourth-party, fifth-party suppliers that we're talking about. And I think all the companies need to do exactly what Kevin described. Go find all your crown jewels. Who are you paying? Categorize them, if you will, and then figure out what would happen if that supplier either failed, had a data breach, wasn't available, if you will, not just on the software side, but I'll say it on the business side. What if fuel management isn't around? If you're a transportation company, what if, Swift on the banking side is not available, or one of your other suppliers? What if your companies that you're working with on clinical trials isn't around? like how would you continue your business? And I think asking these really important questions is the first step to addressing this problem. But third-party risk, in my opinion, we're in inning 1 or maybe inning 2 of this baseball game, if you will, even though the rest of cyber is maybe inning 7. And I think we got a long way to go.
That's a great way to characterize it. And I took so many notes, I'm not even sure where to go now. So here's the Kevin, to your comment about and this embedded evil piece. Some number of years ago when I worked at NSA, one of our greatest fears was what we're seeing now. Some sophisticated adversary gets into the code, gets in somehow, and makes a change. And in the case of third parties, it's a place that most of us would not have expected to have to look. It's as we've seen over and over again now, it's a product that is widely accepted and used. And then the result, of course, is that we've got widespread exploitation, really across the globe. So two-part question. The first is this a nod to an increase in the sophistication of the bad guys? Is this or was this always out there and we just weren't finding it?
Well, no, I don't think it was always out there because it didn't need to be out there. So in a lot of ways, you could say it was defensive success. We got better at cybersecurity, so people had to start thinking, let's hit the supply chain. When you look at the defense industrial base, the bigs got better and better at cybersecurity because they had to. And then it just kind of trickles down from there. Then the mediums have to kind of mature, and then the smalls over time. But the reality is something like SolarWinds only happened because it needed to happen. And I think the risk of that happening every day that goes by, although it's clearly part of the playbook for cyber espionage, I think it's going to be harder to do. Going back to Kelly's point, you got to start with who's in your supply chain. Then you got to prioritize that list. And I kind of skipped that step, but it's not easy. What's the business impact of your suppliers if they go down? What's the impact to customers? What's the impact to your products, your contractual requirements? Are there standards, legislation, and regulations that may apply to how you interact with some of your suppliers? Do you have concentration risks? But you look at how the bigs are starting to manage their supply chain and how my company's managed by folks that we supply, that we're all starting to do better software development, better software, we're more secure at it. SolarWinds got everybody really locked in on that if they weren't prior to that. And it is pushing down. The risk that we have now, and even after SolarWinds, a lot of security professionals are like, well, what would you hit if you wanted to have access to 18,000 companies or 200,000 companies? That list is small and well guarded. The more people use software, the more that software is tested. So the risk that we'll have, in my opinion, when it comes to the next implant, it'll be a hot startup, something that's too small to have great embedded security. They're in a race to market and they unintentionally have a challenge. They might have been targeted by a foreign intelligence service. They produce signed code, but I think the impact's not going to be hundreds of thousands of systems. My hope, when you look at the zone of potential outcomes in the future implant, is it would be 50 customers impacted or something like that. But I'll leave you with this thought. On any given day, like as we're having this panel, somewhere out there's someone writing an app that a year from now, 30 million people are using. And the question is that the app that introduces the vulnerability? But in general, the more widespread and used something is, the more it's been inspected, both by good guys and by bad guys. And let's just hope the good guys did a good job inspecting it.
Do you agree with that, Kelly and Jennifer?
Jennifer, I'll defer to you and then I'll add.
Well, I think I agree. I don't even think I agree with everything that Kevin said. I'd offer, so this is fun. We get to vote if we believe with what Kevin just said. I would say, though, that just a different thought is that I believe a lot of these vulnerabilities have always been there. I think the malicious actors, to Kevin's point, have gotten smarter because they had to. But you have to remember, people weren't asking these questions. They were doing once-a-year surveys, like Kevin went through earlier. And so we weren't asking these questions, so the vulnerabilities existed. And the genesis of all of this is the fact that technology has forever connected us globally to each other in ways that we just don't know unless we ask the question. And that's why I brought up the point earlier about the legislation, because this isn't just a nice to have because you have nuisance things happening or you might be worried if crown jewels you're protecting, but these things are being regulated and mandated now. So there's a real tipping point that's happening because of what's happened. So I think, two things, couldn't agree more. The bad guys have figured out I don't have to hit you direct. I can hit you through your partners because they're not paying attention. They don't fund it correctly. You're not asking them to pay attention. But I think a lot of the vulnerabilities always existed because, again, we were very lazy. We didn't ask the question. We didn't mandate transparency. And that's the turning point that you're seeing happen right now.
Plus, I'll say I think we're both right in that small software is easier to get into in general, I'll say. And sometimes that software is being bought without the CISO's knowledge. The line of business is buying that software like value-added tax software. Who cares about that, so to speak, historically? But knowing what the impact is, especially with history, matters. And I think that this is where the third party is almost like the internet. It's so interconnected, you can't unwind it, if you will. And we got to move away from spreadsheets once a year, just like what we're talking about. We have to have that real-time understanding of that third, fourth, fifth party, so that we know when something occurs, what is the impact to my enterprise, so I know what to do about it, and how do I balance that?
So, so these smaller companies, I mean, one of the outcries from the smaller companies, of course, is that they can't afford the security that a Microsoft or a Mandiant or maybe even Kelly and Interos, maybe your company, they can't afford the security that larger companies can implement. So it becomes a chicken and an egg problem. If larger companies begin to mandate specific security requirements, then sometimes the innovation and the opportunity, for creativity is squelched because, company X can't do it. The flip side, of course, is that you kind of get what you get, and perhaps you're not getting a secure product. What's the solution to that? And this quickly segues into oversight and compliance and contractual language that might require specific security standards be not only established but maintained even by smaller companies. How do we handle that?
Deborah, I'm pretty optimistic. I even think about, Kelly, what you guys can do at Microsoft. You own GitHub right now, where, I don't know, 90% of the world's repositories probably sit. That's an anecdotal thing. Don't quote me on that, and I didn't Wikipedia it. But from development to runtime, the reality is you're going to see tools being created, and they already are being created, that put guardrails for the engineers so they can innovate without thinking security. But all the common functions that all software does, like authentication, encryption, and all these other things, data management, they'll be done in secure ways. And when you think about GitHub and all the repositories there's companies that literally exist solely to scour your GitHub instances. Is your code secure? Yes or no? And then there's runtime inspection as well. So you can see the 4-lane highway of engineering today is going to go down to a 2-lane highway, but the speed limit's going to be faster. There'll be guardrails on developers, but these engineering forward companies are going to innovate even faster and more secure. That being said, that's all optimistic because I think all that's inevitable and will happen. The downside is any incident we have in the future, every day that goes by, we have wearable devices, and the impact of a breach just gets more severe every day. So we're gonna have more secure code, we're gonna have better apps, better interplay, and we'll get our arms around this for the most part. The unfortunate reality is, on the times where the bad guys beat us to the punch is gonna hit us pretty hard.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
I think there are two sides of this, a coin, if you will. I totally agree. That's the future. Where Google's going, where Microsoft's going on securing code as it's being developed, even at runtime, is actually what the market needs. So that's a good thing. But when something occurs, how does that pharma company, how does that manufacturer know that, yes, this company has been breached or has some problem, and therefore I must do something about it. That's really important, because right now, all the CISOs, for the most part, are blind to what that impact means to their business at a real-time basis. Actually, why I'm actually really excited to what Jennifer's company is doing, because I think that can, not to have a commercial for Jennifer, but I think that can actually help solve some of this problem. That's the other side of the coin. So build better secure software, not minimum viable product, but SBOMs, if you will. And how do I understand what the impact of my operations is at real time? That's important.
Yeah, just to kind of sum it up, I think it's people, processes, technology, right? And so, we've just heard a lot around what we're doing for the people, and some of the processes and the technology. But the other thing is to Kelly's last point, things will go bump in the night, and what do you do? And so I think that, without getting too political on here, there's methodologies like CMMC that came out that I actually think had a really good idea, in that it started right-sizing requirements based on what you were doing. And so I kind of look at this as, if you want to do business with the government or a supplier to the government or whomever, then you got to sign up to at least do this, because you have a responsibility. The cool thing about what's happening right now in the world is that we are all in this together. So Kevin's point a few minutes ago, where the more that technology gets created and the more people that use that technology, the more it gets tested, the more it gets shored up. That's all happening in real time. So we're getting better, we're getting more secure, but we do have to remember there's always going to be humans in place, and so you always have to have processes. And so being able to, it's going to sound very redundant here on this panel, but understand the transparency at this point. Who are you doing business with? Who are they doing business with? And is it a good or a bad thing? That's a continuous action, and it's our responsibility anymore.
I wrote it down. That Jennifer said CMMC is a good idea. I did write that down. So we do have a question, and it's from my friend Leslie Ireland, so I do want to get it out there. Leslie asks, how can a company have confidence in the cyber preparedness of your supply chain? She says maybe the bigs, as Kevin has called them, know how to conduct an audit, but how can smaller and mid-sized companies go about this? And how do you evaluate the suppliers of the suppliers?
May I start?
Please.
SOC 2s are not your answer. SOC 2s are not your answer. That's one. The second thing is, I think it's important to not perform an audit. It's not about compliance. It's about an assessment of risk, if you will, and then to do it with the line of business and the security team. And sometimes it happens one or the other, but not both, and that's a problem. So I believe that, one, if we know where our crown jewels across our value chain of our business, we understand all those suppliers, we understand which ones are critical, then we evaluate the effectiveness, if you will, of their controls. This is actually one of the things I loved about where Kevin, where you were going down, is effectiveness of controls within the security layer, which is really important. So if you can do that through your business, whether it's very big or very small, it's not that difficult to do. And the last point I'll add is it really depends on how you have visibility at normal operations, runtime, if you will. Because to do it at a point in time doesn't solve your problem. But to have something in place where you can automatically evaluate what is the risk today, now what is the risk tomorrow, what is the risk the next day, you can evaluate the effectiveness of the controls, but also the risk to your business. And you can actually make decisions very quickly without being exposed too much, like weeks or months, like Kevin and I have seen many companies, have to deal with. So that's what I would suggest.
Yeah, well, and I absolutely agree. And I think the good news, again, is that the technology and the capability exists to do exactly what you just laid out. And so, gone are the days of doing audits, on-site audits, once-a-year audits. It's got to be around continuous monitoring. It's got to be about prioritization. And, the nice thing is that, a lot of this can be handled through exception management, right, Kelly? It's not, you don't have to necessarily understand every single control and every single what everybody else is doing. You have to understand when something occurs, what does it mean to you? And you have to know that it occurred. And so that's why when we talk about the transparency in the supply chain, and there are capabilities like ours that actually do map that out, is looking at pushing that risk as far back as possible and making sure you're continuously monitoring so that when something does occur, a breach does occur, someone stops investing in the right places and processes, that you get ahead of it before it actually impacts you. And I think that continuous monitoring is the only play right now.
And so is it fair to say then that, because ultimately, there needs to be some mechanism by which, these practices are made available to smaller and mid-sized companies? How do they get informed about them? How is it that they get on board with, with the tools that you've talked about, with the scans that you've talked about, with the risk management assessments that you've mentioned? Where do they go?
Well, I actually think that's one of the responsibilities of big tech, is to offer this not only for just enterprises, but also SMBs, because we have to protect the entire ecosystem. And so at Google, at Microsoft, at Amazon, definitely, but also some other players in the market. And where Jennifer's team is going is maybe best in class that I've seen in the market when it comes to that sort of element. So really, I think that even for the smaller companies, unfortunately, you have to look around. You have to be part of this community. You have to be able to be plugged in so you actually understand what is good in the marketplace and how to secure your enterprise with, I think, a partnership with, I'll even call it a partnership. It's a partnership with the technology cloud providers, especially if you're an SMB, because you're going to have to operate and leverage the cloud providers if you're going to succeed in this marketplace.
And so it should be the willing then, and not compelled?
Well, I don't think we can regulate our way out of this problem, just kind of like what Leslie said, if you will. But I think it's a new level of duty of care. I'll call it that.
Okay, I think we're down to like our last minute, but I would love to do a flash round to give each of you a quick moment to just wrap up. This has been a fascinating conversation, really informative. And I'm leaving it much more hopeful than when I started it. Let me just tell you that there's hope out there. So last comments by each of you, please, Kevin.
Oh, I get to be the first of the last. Okay. To me, I've lived through a lot of different maturity cycles in cybersecurity because, since 1993, and this is just another one. We're taking supply chain more seriously now, and it has I feel like Reagan with trickle down economics. It's the same thing over time. The need to have great software development and security and know who your suppliers are is just going to be a common endeavor we all accomplish. We're just getting to it. So, I think Kelly, you said you used baseball. What inning were we in? The third inning?
Second inning.
Probably right. Yeah, second inning. So I think Leslie Ireland asked the hardest question to answer, which is how do the smalls get good? To me, we just have to live the maturity cycle. We're going to make a complex thing simpler and simpler and more economic over time, so that over the next 5 to 10 years, and I think it's going to be compressed in time frame, the supply chain security, especially of software, will be more reliable and dependable. We'll still have challenges, we'll still have issues, but the smalls will be included because as we adopt their software, the bigs are going to be scouring it. So there'll be early indicators and warnings, by the bigs and the mediums, and then over time, because of that, the smalls will be more secure.
That's great. I think we're getting the hook. Matt's here saying time to go. Jennifer, Kelly, Kevin, really great. Pleasure to be with you here on the panel. Really great discussion. And looking forward to a future where we are more secure, as are our third-party vendors. So thank you all.
And thank you, Deborah, as well.